So by the time this YouTube video is public on the platform, we may have already had ourselves some important, juicy Montreal Canadiens quotes. Because their post-season, or not post-season, I should say end-of-season press conference is set to be today, Friday morning at, I think it's going to be 6:30 a.m. my time. Yeah, it's kinda early here. And I have to go to bed, so for me personally, I'm gonna make this video on the night of Thursday, May the 1st, and upload it to YouTube and have its schedule publicly released on Friday. So, this video is being pre-recorded, it doesn't go over any of the comments, we're gonna talk about that when I wake up in the morning and start getting into the regular old show. But this video right here is gonna be a little bit of a philosophical dissection of the Montreal Canadiens and a question as to whether or not that philosophy is the proper way to think about this Montreal Canadiens team. Because what I wanted to do was head over to an article published on TVAsports.ca. This was published yesterday at 6:12 p.m. It's a clip from the JIC show, wherein the hosts mention, "I don't think Martin St. Louis believes in that." What exactly is the scoop here, and why are Tony Marinaro and JIC talking about this? Well, let's go out there and read. Although Tony Marinaro said he was satisfied with the Montreal Canadiens' performance in the first round, which they lost in 5 games to the Capitals, there was one thing that bothered him. He would have preferred that the Montreal Canadiens shook up the opponent a little bit more, instead of constantly turning the other cheek. "That's the only thing that bothers me," Marinaro said during the Les Colisées segment on TVA Sports' JIC show, later adding that he thinks Martin St. Louis simply doesn't believe in this type of hockey. "I think the coach doesn't believe that," he admitted. It's a theory shared by Jean-Charles Lajoie for a very clear reason. St. Louis doesn't understand because he, at 5'8", was never intimidated and was never afraid of anyone. They don't all have the courage he had when he played. The more he got pushed around, the better he was, by the way. Marinaro, on the other hand, would have preferred that Arber Xhekaj get a little more leeway from his coach to impose his law on the ice, even though it risked costing penalties. There were D-men in the history of the NHL, like Dave Manson, like Brian Marchment, who were crazy on the ice, Marinaro recalled. They were unpredictable. Every team wanted them because they were dangerous. I think Arber Xhekaj, even if it costs penalties from time to time, is much more effective for the Habs if he's a dangerous player and when the lines touch. He's capable of anything and everything, even a suspension, which, for me, would be worth it. However, he believes the issue of the big number 72 has caused a lot of noise in Montreal, while there is talk of a 6th or 7th D-man. Was Martin St. Louis right to change Arber Xhekaj's style of play? Only time will tell. Now, this is a really interesting philosophical debate as to how the Canadiens do their business and how they were coached in the playoffs. Arber Xhekaj, you might recognize, he wasn't actually played much against Tom Wilson. There was more of an, okay, the Wilson line's out there, I'm gonna leave type of attitude out of the Xhekaj pairing. And I think, Xhekaj's a big boy, he's a tough guy, he's not gonna go out there and willingly do that from his own accord. That had to have been a decision by the coaching staff to potentially reduce the risk of any penalties for the Canadiens in that series. Now, as we had spoken about yesterday, Tom Wilson said that he thought the Canadiens were playing cheap. Folks did not like those comments, but he did back it up by saying that, yeah, I respect the Habs, etc., but we knew they were going to try to play cheap. And we did speak yesterday as well how when Arber Xhekaj entered the lineup, you saw a few more Canadiens guys kind of standing up Tom Wilson a little bit behind the back with the slew foots, Ivan Demidov tripping up the guy with nobody expecting it. Stuff like that we didn't see too much of before Arber Xhekaj's emergence into the series itself. But I wonder just whether or not that philosophical idea was challenged as much as these analysts on TV are saying it is. Essentially, their argument here is Marty St. Louis focused his team away from being a superimposing physical team that was going out there and dominating with so many hits and everything like that to a potentially destructive capacity. And I have to say that last part because the Habs were hitting a lot. I mean, they had 44 hits in game number 5, which they got eliminated. They out-hit the Washington Capitals by a good chunk. And you could say that same thing about a whole bunch of the other games, that yeah, the Habs are really getting in there and they were making things difficult physically. So I do wonder just to what capacity the folks on TV are questioning Marty St. Louis' game plan here. They're essentially saying that St. Louis' game plan for the Canadiens was to turn the other way instead of being more physically imposing. They wish the Canadiens had shook up the opponent more than just turning the other way. And I think the reasoning they have is actually really interesting. I think it's interesting to dive into Marty St. Louis being a smaller guy, that he himself wasn't so aggressive physically in terms of body checking guys, because quite frankly, he couldn't be. He was playing in that era. He couldn't be a 6'6" bruiserweight going out there and laying the smackdown on everybody. That was just impossible for his game plan. But to see him get shoved around, see him get dragged into the fight, that made him play better. So the question that the folks on TVA are presenting is whether or not that mindset that Marty St. Louis had as a player bleeds into the way he coached the Montreal Canadiens in this series, and whether or not that was the game plan the Habs had subconsciously for themselves. I don't necessarily know to what capacity that's correct, but I do wonder just how much more the Canadiens could have given if the game plan was to be physical, rough and tough, not hitting guys in a cheap way, not playing cheap like Tom Wilson insinuated the Canadiens did, but just fully going out there and stomping on dudes. We know that some players can't do that. Cole Caulfield, Lane Hudson, they're not going to go out there and really hit anybody too hard. Slafkovsky, though, he had 7 hits in game number 5. Do you want more out of him? Do you want more out of Mike Matheson, David Savard, other guys on the back end? Do you want more out of Xhekaj? I think essentially what the biggest argument boils down to here in this conversation is whether or not Arber Xhekaj did enough for the Canadiens to make worthwhile the presence he had on the team. He could have been a little bit more reckless, he could have been a little bit more agitating. But I guess Marty St. Louis, as indicated by the game plan where Xhekaj would leave the ice every time Tom Wilson came on, I guess a secondary priority for St. Louis and his coaching staff was to make sure no penalties were given out. And that honestly makes sense. Like, of course, you don't want to see your team take any unnecessary penalties, but it's the playoffs. There are moments where I guess some calls that would have been made in the regular season do not get called. And I guess the Habs also did have bad luck with the penalties in this series too, so you don't want to test fate a little bit more. But I do kind of wonder just where this philosophical talk will lead to in the comment section, so I want you to let me know your thoughts. How do you feel about Tony Marinaro and Jean-Charles Lajoie calling out Marty St. Louis' coaching in this way on the JIC show after the Habs' elimination at the hands of the Capitals? Do you think it's a realistic and valid criticism to have of St. Louis and the way he performed as head coach of the Habs this series? Let me know in the comments. What do you think? I hope you enjoyed this video. Sign and bye.